Wealthy woman insults a royal guard, stops cold when he did this. The clicking of Amelia Hawthorne's Louboutin heels echoed through the palace's tourist section, a sound that seemed to announce her presence as effectively as a royal herald. Unlike the wide-eyed tourists around her who pressed against the velvet ropes with their smartphones, she walked with the confidence of someone who believed they owned every space they entered. Her assistant, Marcus, hurried behind her, juggling her designer handbag and a tablet displaying her packed schedule. "Honestly, Marcus, I don't understand why Daddy insisted I handle the London expansion personally," she said, her voice carrying that distinctive tone of the perpetually inconvenienced. "We have people for this sort of thing." Marcus, ever diplomatic, adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses. "Your father believed having a Hawthorne personally oversee the acquisition would show respect for British business traditions, Miss Amelia." "Traditions?" she scoffed, pausing to check her reflection in a gilded mirror. Her dark hair was perfectly styled, her makeup flawless, a fact she confirmed with a satisfied smile. "That's all London seems to care about. Traditions and ceremony and—" She gestured dismissively at a royal guard standing perfectly still at his post. "People pretending to be statues." The guard stood motionless, his red uniform pristine, his bearskin cap adding to his impressive height. His eyes stared straight ahead, focused on some distant point only he could see. The tourist crowd kept a respectful distance, occasionally snapping photos but maintaining the required space. Amelia, however, had never been one to respect boundaries. She broke away from her group, sauntering closer to the guard. His stillness irritated her somehow. It felt like a challenge to her authority, as if his very immobility was a statement that not everything would bend to her will. "Look at this, Marcus," she said, circling the guard like a shark. "Paid to stand here all day, doing absolutely nothing. What a pointless job." She leaned in closer, her voice dropping to a stage whisper. "I bet I could do whatever I want, and you wouldn't even flinch." Marcus shifted uncomfortably. "Miss Amelia, perhaps we should continue the tour." No, this is interesting." She studied the guard's face. He was younger than she'd expected, probably in his early 30s, with sharp cheekbones and eyes that, despite staring straight ahead, seemed to hold an intensity that made her pause for just a moment. But Amelia Hawthorne didn't back down, especially not from someone she considered beneath her. She pulled out her phone, holding it inches from his face. "Say cheese!" The flash went off, but the guard remained perfectly still. "Look at this, Marcus. Not even a blink. I wonder." She reached out, her manicured fingers almost touching the brass buttons of his uniform. "Miss Amelia!" Marcus's warning came too late. Her finger had already made contact with one of the buttons. The guard's voice came suddenly, deep and commanding. "Step back behind the line, please." Amelia jumped, startled not just by the voice but by something in it, an authority she wasn't used to hearing directed at her. For a split second, their eyes met, and she felt a chill run down her spine. There was something in his gaze, something that seemed to see right through her carefully constructed facade of superiority. She recovered quickly, forcing a laugh that sounded hollow even to her own ears. "Oh, so it does speak. How fascinating. Did you have to practice that line for hours, or does it come naturally with the job?" The guard resumed his silence, but Amelia couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. His stillness no longer seemed like submission, it felt like power. "Miss Amelia," Marcus interjected, "we really should proceed to your next appointment. The investors are waiting." Fine. She waved her hand dismissively, but as she turned to leave, she couldn't resist one final barb. "You know," she said to the guard, "in the time you spend standing here doing nothing, I'll probably make more money than you see in a year. But I suppose someone has to do these ceremonial jobs." As she walked away, she felt a strange urge to look back. When she did, the guard was still standing there, motionless as ever, but something about his presence seemed different. It was as if his stillness had become a warning rather than a weakness. "The investors' meeting is at 7, Marcus said, trying to redirect her attention to business matters. "Then you have the gala at 9. Yes, I know." Amelia adjusted her bracelet, a diamond piece worth more than most people's homes. Another evening of pretending to care about what old men in suits have to say about market dynamics. She smiled, the expression not reaching her eyes. At least I'll be the most interesting person in the room. As they exited the palace, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the courtyard. Amelia felt a sudden, inexplicable urge to turn around one last time. The guard was still visible through the doorway, standing at his post, unchanging and unmoved. But if she had looked more carefully, she might have noticed his eyes tracking her departure. She might have seen the slight tension in his jaw, the barely perceptible shift in his stance. She might have realized that while she had dismissed him as nothing more than a living statue, he had marked her as something else entirely. Instead, she stepped into her waiting car, already thinking about the evening ahead, completely unaware that her life was about to change dramatically. The diamond bracelet on her wrist caught the light as she checked her phone, glittering like a beacon, or perhaps a target. The car pulled away from the palace, carrying its passenger toward a destiny she couldn't yet imagine. Behind her, the guard remained at his post, silent and watchful, holding secrets that would soon reshape Amelia Hawthorne's entire world. The crystal chandeliers of the Dorchester's ballroom cast a golden glow over London's elite as they mingled beneath, their jewelry catching and reflecting light like stars brought down to earth. Amelia Hawthorne stood at the center of it all, holding court among a circle of admirers who hung on her every word about the Hawthorne Empire's planned expansion into the British market. "It's really quite simple," she said, gesturing with her champagne flute. "The British market is practically begging for American innovation. They just don't know it yet." She smiled, knowing the weight her words carried. After all, she was Amelia Hawthorne, and her opinion was worth millions. The diamond bracelet on her wrist caught the light as she raised her glass for a toast. "To new ventures and—" the words died in her throat. Something felt wrong. The familiar weight on her wrist was gone. She looked down. The bracelet, her mother's bracelet, worth over $2 million, had vanished. There was no clasp failure, no sign of it falling. It was as if it had simply evaporated from her wrist. "Everything all right, Miss Hawthorne?" asked one of the investors, noticing her sudden pallor. Excuse me." She hurried away from the group, eyes scanning the floor frantically. Marcus appeared at her side, sensing trouble. "Miss Amelia?" "My bracelet," she hissed. "It's gone. Lock down the exits. Call security. Nobody leaves until we find it." But hours of searching yielded nothing. The bracelet had disappeared as completely as if it had never existed. As she left the gala in the early hours of the morning, Amelia felt a strange sense of vulnerability she'd never experienced before. The next morning, she decided retail therapy would lift her spirits. The exclusive boutiques of Bond Street beckoned, promising the comfort of expensive distractions. She selected an array of designer pieces, barely glancing at the prices. When the sales assistant ran her card, however, her world tilted again. "I'm sorry, Miss Hawthorne, but your card has been declined." "That's impossible. Try it again." The assistant did, with the same result. Amelia pulled out another card. Declined. And another. All declined. Her phone call to the bank brought even more disturbing news. All her accounts had been frozen due to suspicious activity. Not just frozen, but emptied. Millions of dollars, gone without a trace. "This is ridiculous." She snapped at Marcus as they left the store empty-handed. "Call Daddy's lawyers. Call the bank managers. Call everyone." But her father's lawyers were mysteriously unavailable. The bank managers had no answers. For the first time in her life, Amelia Hawthorne's name and connections seemed to count for nothing. She insisted on keeping her dinner reservation at the Ritz that evening, determined to maintain some semblance of normalcy. The car service she'd hired pulled up outside her hotel, not her usual chauffeur, who had inexplicably called in sick. The driver took an unfamiliar route, winding through narrow streets she didn't recognize. When she questioned him, he merely mumbled something about avoiding traffic. Then, with a sudden hiss of air, the car lurched to the right. All 4 tires had been slashed simultaneously, as if by some invisible force. The driver got out to inspect the damage, leaving her alone in the back seat. Through the window, she caught a glimpse of something that made her shocked, a figure in black, disappearing around a corner. Not running, but moving with deliberate purpose. "Marcus," she whispered, gripping her phone tightly. "I don't think these are coincidences anymore." For the first time since arriving in London, Amelia felt truly afraid. The city's glamour had dissolved, revealing something darker beneath its polished surface. As she huddled in the disabled car, waiting for help to arrive, she remembered the guard's unwavering gaze at Buckingham Palace. His stillness now seemed less like ceremony and more like vigilance. A text message appeared on her phone from an unknown number. "Your father's debts are coming due." She stared at the words until they blurred, her hands shaking. What debts? Her father was one of the wealthiest men in America. What wasn't she being told? As darkness fell over London, Amelia Hawthorne, who had always seen the world as her playground, began to feel like a player in someone else's game. The streets outside seemed to whisper with secrets, and every shadow held the possibility of threat. She had no way of knowing that this was only the beginning, that each misfortune was a carefully placed piece in a larger puzzle. As she finally made her way back to her hotel, she failed to notice the familiar figure watching from across the street, a guard no longer in his ceremonial uniform, but moving with the same measured precision that had once held her mockery. The game was in motion, and Amelia Hawthorne was about to learn that some traditions existed not for ceremony, but for protection. And some guards stood still not out of duty, but out of purpose. Amelia stumbled out of the Blue Dragon, an upscale bar in Mayfair, her confidence shaken but her pride still intact. Marcus had finally gone home for the night, despite his protests about leaving her alone. The evening's attempt to network with potential investors had failed miserably. Word of her frozen accounts had spread through London's business circles like wildfire. The cool night air hit her face as she checked her phone. No new messages from her father's lawyers, no updates from the bank. Only that same cryptic text about debts glowing on her screen. She shoved the phone into her purse, her hands trembling slightly. Whether from anger or fear, she wasn't sure anymore. The street was quieter than usual, most of the high-end shops already closed. Her heels clicked against the pavement as she took a shortcut through a narrow passage between 2 buildings. The route would save her 10 minutes on her walk back to the hotel, time she desperately needed to figure out her next move. The first warning was subtle, a reflection in a darkened shop window of a shadow moving too quickly, too purposefully. Before she could fully process what she'd seen, a hand clamped over her mouth from behind, rough leather gloves muffling her scream. "Miss Hawthorne," a voice whispered, accent untraceable. "Your father's time has run out. Now it's your turn to pay." She was dragged backward, her expensive heels scraping against the cobblestones. A black van idled at the alley's entrance, its side door sliding open with an ominous hiss. Terror gripped her chest as the reality of her situation crashed down. This wasn't about money anymore. This was about survival. Then she heard it, a sound so quiet it might have been imagination. A single footstep, deliberate and measured. "Release her." The command cut through the darkness like a blade. Amelia's eyes widened as she recognized the voice. Her captor spun around, still holding her firmly, and she caught a glimpse of a familiar figure at the alley's entrance. The royal guard, except he wasn't in his ceremonial uniform anymore. He wore dark tactical gear, moving with the fluid grace of a predator. "This doesn't concern you," her captor growled, but there was an edge of uncertainty in his voice. "Release her," the guard repeated, "or I will be forced to demonstrate exactly how much it concerns me." Everything happened in a blur after that. Her captor shoved her aside, reaching for something in his jacket. But before he could grab whatever weapon he was carrying, the guard moved. The precision she had witnessed in his ceremonial stance transformed into lethal efficiency. In 3 moves, her attacker was on the ground, arm twisted at an unnatural angle, face pressed against the cobblestones. The guard held him down with one knee while pulling out a phone. He spoke quickly into it, giving their location in a series of clipped codes. Amelia stood frozen, her back pressed against the cold brick wall. Her guard, looked up at her, and for the first time, she saw his eyes clearly. They held the same intensity she noticed at the palace, but now she understood it wasn't ceremonial at all. It was the gaze of someone who saw everything, anticipated everything. "Are you hurt, Miss Hawthorne?" he asked, his voice gentler than before but still carrying that note of authority. She shook her head, unable to form words. In the distance, sirens wailed. "The police will be here soon," he said, maintaining pressure on her would-be kidnapper. "You'll need to give a statement." Finally, she found her voice. How did you know? Why are you here?" He looked at her for a long moment, and she saw something flicker across his face. Hesitation, perhaps, or calculation. "You need to be careful, Miss Hawthorne. Your father's past is catching up with you." Before she could ask what he meant, police cars flooded the street, bathing the alley in rotating blue lights. In the chaos that followed, the statements, the questions, the parade of officers and detectives, she lost track of him. When she finally looked around, he had vanished as completely as her diamond bracelet had at the gala. But his words echoed in her mind, "Your father's past is catching up with you." As she sat in the back of a police car, wrapped in a shock blanket she didn't remember receiving, Amelia Hawthorne realized that everything she thought she knew about her life, her family, and her world was unraveling. And somehow, and possibly, a royal guard she had mocked stood at the center of it all. She pulled out her phone with shaking hands and stared at the cryptic text message again. Her father's debts are coming due. For the first time, she wondered if the debt wasn't measured in money at all. Inside her hotel suite at the Ritz, Amelia spread dozens of documents across the mahogany desk, her fingers trembling as she uncovered each new piece of evidence. After the attack, she'd spent sleepless hours digging through her father's digital archives, using passwords she'd discovered years ago during her rebellious teenage phase, passwords he never knew she had. The laptop's harsh glow illuminated her face as she stared at damning evidence that threatened to shatter her entire worldview. Encrypted emails with coded language about merchandise transfers, offshore account numbers in the Cayman Islands and Switzerland, and most disturbing of all, photographs. Her father, looking a decade younger, dressed in casual clothes she'd never seen him wear, shaking hands with men whose faces she recognized from true crime documentaries. "Marcus," she called, her voice barely above a whisper. "The timeline matches perfectly." She pointed to a document dated 2009. "Remember when Hawthorne Industries suddenly acquired those premium British shipping routes? Everyone called it a miracle of negotiation. The money didn't come from investors at all, it came from the Miller Syndicate," Marcus finished, adjusting his glasses nervously. "They were one of the most sophisticated criminal organizations in Europe until they were dismantled 3 years ago. But Miss Amelia, if your father was involved with them..." A sharp knock interrupted his thought. Both jumped at the sound. A hotel staff member delivered a manila envelope marked "Urgent Personal." Inside, Amelia found a single photograph that shocked her, her father standing next to Victor Miller himself, the notorious crime boss who had disappeared during the raid. On the back, written in crimson ink that looked disturbingly, "Your father betrayed us all. Now watch everything he built crumble to dust." Her phone buzzed continuously. Notifications flooded in. All her social media accounts had been hacked simultaneously. Posts appeared claiming insider knowledge of Hawthorne Industries' involvement in international money laundering. The company's stock would nosedive when markets opened. "Miss Amelia," Marcus said, his voice unusually grave. "There's something else." He pulled up security footage from the hotel's lobby. The timestamp read 3:27 a.m., while she'd been sleeping. 3 men in immaculate suits entered, spoke briefly with the night manager who visibly paled at their presence, and left. Their faces matched those from her father's old photographs. "They're not just watching us," Amelia realized. "They're letting us know we're being watched." The sharp crack of breaking glass made them both duck. A small, perfectly round hole appeared in the window, a sniper's bullet, precisely placed. Not meant to kill, but to terrorize. "We need to leave," Marcus urged, already gathering essential documents. But Amelia remained frozen, staring at her laptop screen. She just uncovered an email thread that changed everything. Subject line: Operation Guardian Angel. The emails detailed an elaborate agreement between her father and an unnamed British intelligence unit. In exchange for providing critical information about the Miller Syndicate's operations, the Hawthorne family would receive permanent protection. The most recent email was dated just 2 weeks ago, days before her father had insisted she handled the London expansion personally. "He knew," she whispered, pieces clicking into place. "He knew they were coming for revenge, and he sent me here anyway." "But why?" Her answer came in the form of a classified personnel file that had no business being in her father's possession. The photograph made her gasp audibly. Officer James Sinclair. The Royal Guard who'd stood so still, who she'd mocked so carelessly. His real identity stunned her, one of British intelligence's most effective undercover operatives, specializing in close protection detail. His position at Palace was legitimate, but it served a deeper purpose. For 15 years, he'd been assigned to one crucial mission, protecting the Hawthorne family from the shadows, guarding them from the consequences of her father's dangerous double game. Every incident since her arrival in London took on new meaning: the stolen bracelet, the frozen accounts, the sabotaged car. They weren't random attacks. They were calculated moves in an elaborate chess game, designed to draw out their enemies while keeping her within the guard's protective reach. Her phone rang, displaying her father's private number. Her hands trembled as she answered. "Daddy?" "Princess." Her father's voice was strained with worry. "You've found the truth, haven't you? I'm so sorry. I needed you to understand, to see it all for yourself. They're coming to take everything we have. But James, trust James. He's been our guardian angel since you were in high school. Every business trip to London, every coincidental meeting with British investors, he was there, watching, protecting. Why didn't you tell me everything from the beginning?" "Because, Princess, I needed them to believe you were vulnerable. They had to think." The line went dead with chilling finality. A text message appeared instantly. "Time's up. Attend the Miller Charity Gala tomorrow night alone, or your father disappears permanently." Amelia looked up to find James Sinclair standing in her doorway, his ceremonial uniform replaced by tactical gear. His expression was deadly serious. "They'll be expecting you to come alone," he said, his voice carrying the same authority she'd first heard at the palace. "I know." She stood straighter, finding reserves of strength she never knew she possessed. "But I won't be, will I?" For the first time, she saw him smile, brief and dangerous, like a wolf showing its teeth. "No, Miss Hawthorne. You won't be." The night air whistled through the bullet hole in the window, a reminder that the game wasn't over. It was just beginning. The Miller Foundation's charity gala gleamed like a jewel in London's night, but Amelia knew every sparkle concealed a blade. She stepped out of her car wearing a midnight blue evening gown, a hidden earpiece barely visible beneath her styled hair. "Remember," James's voice came through, crisp and clear. "Once inside, you'll be on your own for the first few minutes. We need them to believe you came alone." The grand hall of the converted warehouse had been transformed into an elegant venue. Crystal chandeliers hung from exposed beams, creating an unsettling contrast between luxury and industrial architecture. Faces turned as she entered, some curious, others hungry with anticipation. A waiter offered champagne. She took a glass but didn't drink, remembering James's warning about potential threats. Her eyes scanned the crowd, noting positions of exits and security cameras. "Miss Hawthorne." A smooth voice behind her made her spine stiffen. "How brave of you to come." She turned to face Victor Miller himself, older than in the photographs, but his eyes still held the same calculated malice. "Where is my father?" "Straight to business. Just like him." Miller smiled, gesturing toward a steel staircase. "Shall we discuss this somewhere more private?" The earpiece crackled. "Amelia, don't go. It's too isolated." But she was already moving, following Miller up the stairs. Each step felt like walking deeper into a trap, but she had no choice. Her father's life hung in the balance. The upper floor was darker, illuminated only by emergency exit signs. Miller led her to an office overlooking the main hall. "Your father thought he could outsmart us," he said, pouring himself a drink. "Feeding information while profiting from our operations. A clever game, until it wasn't. Where is he?" Miller pressed a button on his desk. A screen lit up, showing live footage of her father tied to a chair in some unknown location. "Safe for now. But his future depends entirely on you." Movement in her peripheral vision, armed men emerging from shadows, blocking her escape routes. The earpiece went dead with static. "You see, my dear, your father's betrayal cost us billions. We're here to collect." Miller's smile turned cruel. "The Hawthorne Empire will be signed over to us, every asset, every penny. And you'll do it willingly or—" The lights went out. In the sudden darkness, Amelia heard it, the sound of breaking glass, followed by precise, efficient movement. A flash of light illuminated James dropping from the ceiling, his moves synchronized with a team of operatives who crashed through windows and doors simultaneously. The fight that followed was choreographed chaos. James moved like a force of nature, each strike calculated and devastating. In the strobing emergency lights, she caught glimpses of him taking down armed men twice his size, his training evident in every motion. "Get down!" he shouted, tackling her as gunfire erupted. They rolled behind a desk as bullets splintered wood around them. James pulled a device from his tactical vest, pressed a button, and smoke filled the room. "When I say run, head for the south stairwell," he whispered, his body shielding her from debris. Miller's voice cut through the chaos. "You can't protect them forever, Sinclair. The debt must be paid. The only debt here," James called back, "is to justice." He turned to Amelia. "Now!" They ran through the smoke, James guiding her with one hand while returning fire with the other. Behind them, she heard Miller screaming orders, followed by the sounds of his men being systematically taken down by James's team. They burst through the emergency exit into the cold night air. A helicopter thundered overhead, its searchlight painting the scene in harsh white. Vehicles surrounded the building, red and blue lights reflecting off wet pavement. "Your father is safe," James said as they reached cover. "We found him an hour ago. This was never about a trade, it was about getting Miller in the open." Amelia stared at him, realization dawning. "You used me as bait?" "No," he corrected, his eyes softening slightly. "We gave you a chance to help us finish what your father started. And you did exactly what we knew you would, you chose to be brave." Above them, the helicopter spotlight caught Miller trying to escape across the roof. But there was nowhere left to run. 15 years of shadows and secrets were finally dragged into the light. And in that moment, watching James coordinate the operation with calm efficiency, Amelia realized that the still guard she mocked had actually been a coiled spring, waiting for exactly this moment to unleash his true power. 6 months after the Miller incident, Buckingham Palace's halls echoed with the same tourist chatter, but Amelia Hawthorne walked them differently now. Gone was the clicking of designer heels, replaced by sensible flats. Her father, cleared of major charges in exchange for his cooperation, had stepped down from Hawthorne Industries. She now led the company, steering it toward legitimate ventures with a focus on charitable initiatives. Approaching the familiar guard post, she smiled at James Sinclair, who stood as motionless as ever in his ceremonial uniform. To tourists, he was just another guard, but she knew better. His ongoing position here served multiple purposes, maintaining his cover while allowing him to monitor diplomatic threats to the crown. "Officer Sinclair," she said quietly, standing at a respectful distance. "I received your message about security concerns at our new youth center project." His eyes remained forward, but his voice carried that familiar authority she'd come to trust. "Perhaps we could discuss it over coffee, Miss Hawthorne. My shift ends in 10 minutes. Later, at a small cafe away from tourist crowds, they sat across from each other, the guard and the heiress, both transformed by shared experience. The youth center is more than just rehabilitation, Amelia explained, spreading out blueprints. It's about preventing others from falling into the traps my father did, giving them legitimate opportunities. James studied the plans with professional interest. The security measures are solid, but you'll need additional coverage here and here. He marked 2 points on the blueprint. Some of the teens you're helping might have connections we need to monitor. That's why I wanted your input. She paused, gathering courage. And that's not the only reason I asked you here. He looked up, his expression softening slightly. The board is creating a new security division, she continued. We need someone who understands both the corporate world and tactical operations. Someone who can protect not just assets, but principles. Are you offering me a job, Miss Hawthorne? I'm offering you a partnership. She met his gaze steadily. You've spent 15 years protecting my family from the shadows. Maybe it's time to step into the light. For a long moment, he was as still as he'd been at his post. Then he smiled, not the dangerous smile from the night of the raid, but something warmer. I'll need to discuss it with my superiors, he said. But I think we could arrange something. Perhaps a joint operation between Hawthorne Industries and British intelligence? Perfect. She returned his smile. And James? Thank you. Not just for saving us, but for showing me what real strength looks like. What real duty means. As they left the cafe, they passed a group of tourists heading toward the palace. One young woman, dressed expensively, was complaining loudly about the ridiculous traditions of the guards. Amelia and James shared a knowing look. She thought about stopping, about telling the young woman what she'd learned, that sometimes the most powerful people are the ones who choose to stand still, that true strength often lies in quiet service rather than loud proclamations. Instead, she simply watched the tourists pass, remembering her own journey from arrogance to understanding. The guard who had seemed so beneath her had turned out to be her guardian angel, teaching her that respect isn't earned by wealth or status, but by character and actions. Same time next week? James asked as they prepared to part ways. Of course, Amelia replied. After all, someone needs to keep watching. As she walked away, she smiled at the thought of him returning to his post, standing still yet ever vigilant. The guard who was always there, who would always be there, not just for her family now, but for all those who needed protection and guidance. The sun set over London, casting long shadows across the palace grounds. In one of those shadows, a guard stood motionless, watching over his charge, not because he had to, but because he chose to. And in her office across the city, an heiress worked to build something new, something better, having learned that the greatest power lies not in standing above others, but in standing beside them.